In the dead of night, while Moscow slept under a blanket of silence, a single phone call crossed continents. A call that no one expected and no one could ignore. At 3 a.m, a young African captain dared to confront one of the world's most powerful men, and what he said left the Kremlin in stunned silence. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré's midnight conversation. A tale of defiance, betrayal, and a continent rising against the weight of history. Stay with us as we unravel the mystery, the suspense, and the moment that shook empires. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful cinematic narrations that reveal the hidden battles shaping our world. The Kremlin was built to withstand centuries of storms, wars, revolutions, betrayals. Its red walls had heard the whispers of czars and the shouts of commissars, the plotting of generals and the schemes of spies. But on this night, a different sound echoed through its marble halls, the shrill, insistent ring of a secure phone at 3 a.m. Sleep still clung to the air. Moscow was wrapped in silence, the city blanketed under a gray, frozen sky. Deep inside the fortress, a light flickered on in a narrow chamber. The man who ruled Russia sat upright in his chair, eyes narrowing at the blinking red line. Few dared disturb him at this hour. Fewer still would dare to call directly. Yet the signal pulsed, urgent, unavoidable. When the receiver lifted, a voice carried across continents. It was not a Western president, nor a European banker. It was a voice from Ouagadougou, steady but sharp, the voice of a man young enough to be his son, yet carrying the weight of a generation. It was the voice of Ibrahim Traoré. The words were calm, deliberate, and cloaked in mystery. The conversation did not begin with pleasantries. It began with fire. He spoke of chains buried in gold contracts, of Africa's hunger feeding Europe's wealth, of soldiers left to die so empires could breathe. He spoke of betrayal, of shadows moving against him, of a new dawn waiting to be born in the ashes of the old. Each sentence struck like a hammer against the Kremlin's marble heart. The Russian leader listened, silent, expression carved in stone. For years, Moscow had watched Africa with careful calculation, a chessboard where pawns bled while kings remained untouchable. Yet now, in the middle of the night, a single voice challenged that board. Not with armies, not with missiles, but with truth that carried the weight of centuries. The silence in the chamber grew heavy. Generals shifted uneasily in nearby offices, sensing something was wrong but not daring to interrupt. Intelligence officers exchanged glances in the shadows, knowing the call would alter the shape of things to come. Across the wires, the young captain's words grew sharper. He spoke not like a man begging for help, nor like a man seeking permission, but like a man declaring a verdict. His voice was not asking, it was announcing. And in that moment, the old order trembled. For what Ibrahim Traoré said in that call would shake the Kremlin to its foundations. And by the end of the night, nothing would ever be the same again. Long before the Kremlin's phone rang at 3 a.m., the ground beneath Ouagadougou had already begun to shake. The story of Ibrahim Traoré was not born in comfort, nor in the quiet halls of power. It was born in hunger, in dust, in the weary eyes of mothers watching their children fade beneath a merciless sun. Burkina Faso had been carved and bled by foreign hands long before his birth. Its gold, richer than the soil of empires, flowed east and west, filling the vaults of banks that had never seen its deserts. Its people, left with scraps, labored under the weight of debts they had not created. The International Monetary Fund came dressed as a benefactor, carrying contracts and promises, but behind every clause was a chain. Each loan was another shackle. Each structural adjustment was another wound. By the time Traoré stepped forward, the scars were deep. Markets lay barren. Young men drifted to war or exile. Children fainted in schools for lack of food. Elders whispered of Thomas Sankara, the ghost of a captain who had once promised dignity and dared to defy the world. His portrait still hung in cracked homes, eyes burning with a fire the people longed to see again. Traoré had not sought glory. He had been a soldier, young but hardened by the cruelty of war. In the barracks, he saw men broken by battles not their own, sent to die in conflicts fed by foreign interests. He learned that the true war was not fought with rifles, but with contracts, resources, and silence. When the people called, when the streets erupted in rage against corruption and betrayal, Traoré stepped forward not because he was ready, but because no one else dared. His rise was meteoric, but his burden heavier than iron. At 34, he carried the weight of centuries. And with every speech, every decree, every act of defiance, he drew eyes from far beyond the Sahel. In Washington, he was labeled dangerous. In Paris, reckless. In London, naive. But in Moscow, the reaction was quieter. Russia watched carefully, intrigued by the audacity of a man so young, so fearless. In the corridors of the Kremlin, analysts whispered that Traoré was no ordinary officer. He was an echo of Sankara, a spark that could ignite a continent. At first, Moscow calculated him as a piece on the board. Africa was a theater where influence could be traded, alliances forged, resources secured. But soon unease crept in. Traoré was not predictable. He did not align easily. He rejected offers with the same firmness he rejected threats. He welcomed support but refused submission. And this baffled the Kremlin. As sanctions tightened from the West, Burkina Faso's suffering deepened. Gold reserves dwindled under suspicious trades. Crops failed under unusual droughts. Fuel lines stretched across the capital as whispers of sabotage spread. Families scraped together meals from scraps of millet, while foreign companies extracted wealth beneath their feet. Hunger became a weapon, wielded silently, invisibly. Yet in this bleakness, a strange force stirred. Crowds gathered not in despair but in defiance. Farmers who once bent under debt now carried banners of resistance. Children sang songs of freedom instead of fear. Women marched, their voices louder than the gunfire that often chased them. And at the center of this storm stood Traoré, his military suit worn like armor, his red beret glowing like a flame. But shadows moved against him. Deep in Ouagadougou's corridors of power, whispers of betrayal began to grow. Old generals, envious of his rise, whispered with foreign emissaries. Agents from beyond Africa's borders infiltrated the streets, sowing division with quiet precision. Even within his own council, loyalty grew uncertain. In Moscow, intelligence officers monitored these movements with precision. Reports arrived daily. Plots against Traoré, secret Western deals, gold caravans diverted, arms shipments intercepted. The Kremlin debated quietly. Should Russia extend its hand or watch from the shadows? Some argued he could become an ally, a wedge against the West. Others warned that aligning too closely could drag Moscow into a fire it was not ready to contain. And yet, the young captain's name would not leave their lips. In strategy meetings, in hushed conversations, in dossiers marked confidential, his presence loomed. He was no longer just a soldier in Burkina Faso. He was becoming a force that could ripple across continents. By late autumn, the tension became unbearable. Reports suggested that Traoré had uncovered not only plots against his government, but also secret agreements stretching from Paris to Washington, and perhaps even Moscow itself. For the Kremlin, the game had grown dangerous. They needed clarity. That was when the call came. Not from Moscow, not from Paris, but from Ouagadougou. At 3 a.m, when Moscow slept under its iron sky, Ibrahim Traoré reached across the darkness of continents to speak directly to the heart of the Kremlin. His words would not be filtered through emissaries or twisted in reports. He would speak for himself. And in the silence of that hour, the Kremlin would discover that the young African captain was not asking to be recognized. He was demanding to be heard. The weeks that followed were a storm. In Ouagadougou, Traoré stood at the center of a battlefield with no clear front lines. By day, he addressed his people with words of hope, reminding them that hunger was not permanent, that dignity could not be erased by debt. But by night, reports arrived on his desk like shadows creeping beneath the door. Armed groups, emboldened by foreign backers, struck villages, burning grain stores and terrorizing farmers. Gold shipments vanished along desert routes, stolen not by bandits, but by highly organized units too well equipped to be ordinary thieves. The young captain had stepped into power, believing the greatest threat would come from within his borders. He now realized the battlefield was much larger. His defiance had awakened forces across the globe. Paris tightened its grip, cutting off trade routes and freezing assets. Washington applied pressure with threats of sanctions, whispering that Traoré was a destabilizing force. London spread stories in the press, painting him as a reckless soldier intoxicated by power. And yet, none of these blows frightened him as much as the whispers of betrayal within his own walls. One evening, his intelligence chief laid out documents that chilled the room. Several high-ranking officials had been in contact with foreign diplomats, conspiring to undermine him from the inside. Promises of wealth, safe havens, and power were exchanged like coins. Traoré's circle was shrinking, and he knew it. Still, he refused to bend. His speeches grew sharper, echoing Sankara's defiance. "Burkina Faso," he declared, "will not remain a playground for empires. We will not starve so others may feast." Crowds roared in the streets, waving flags, their voices shaking the air. To the people, he was not just a leader, he was a shield. A spark of dignity in a world that had long stolen theirs. But to the great powers, he was becoming dangerous. Too dangerous? Strange things began to happen. Military supplies ordered months before suddenly vanished in transit. Bank transfers to fund food aid were inexplicably delayed, blocked by technical issues. Grain deliveries meant for starving children were rerouted, never arriving. Each act was not a coincidence, it was a strategy. Hunger was the weapon. Despair was the battlefield. And through it all, Traoré wore his military suit and his red beret like a banner, standing tall even as the storm gathered far away. In the Kremlin's guarded halls, the debate over Traoré grew heated. Some Russian advisors saw him as an opportunity, an ally who could tilt Africa away from Western control. Others warned he was a firebrand who could drag Moscow into unnecessary conflict. Reports from Russian intelligence painted a picture of a man too stubborn to control, too principled to manipulate. One evening, a confidential briefing reached the Kremlin. Traoré had intercepted communication suggesting that both Western and Eastern powers were maneuvering in secret against his nation's sovereignty. He had evidence, contracts, recordings, agreements that could expose the quiet war being waged over Africa. The Kremlin was unsettled. If true, these revelations could destabilize far more than Burkina Faso. They could unravel delicate alliances and expose the hidden hands that shaped global politics, and then came the whisper that shifted everything. Traoré was planning to call Moscow directly, not through envoys, not through intermediaries, not through carefully worded letters that could be ignored. He would speak directly to the Kremlin itself. The timing was deliberate. Midnight in Ouagadougou, 3 in the morning in Moscow when silence wrapped the Kremlin in darkness. Traoré wanted no audience, no interruptions, no theatrics. Only truth. But as that hour approached, tensions in the Burkina Faso capital reached a boiling point. Protests erupted outside the presidential compound, not against Traoré, but against the poverty strangling the people. Mothers demanded bread. Fathers demanded work. Foreign agents mingled within the crowds, stoking chaos, hoping to push the nation into collapse before the young captain could steady it. Inside, Traoré paced the dimly lit corridors, his red beret casting a shadow across his determined face. Advisors begged him to delay, to reconsider, but he shook his head. If the world wishes to test Africa, he said quietly, then Africa must finally answer. In Moscow, Kremlin aides received word of the impending call. Some dismissed it as bravado. Others insisted it be taken seriously. When the phone finally rang, deep within the stone heart of the Kremlin, silence fell. No one spoke. No one moved. The connection was established. The line was open. The moment had arrived, and what Ibrahim Traoré said in that midnight conversation would pierce through centuries of silence, leaving the Kremlin stunned in a way they had not anticipated. The clock struck 3. The Kremlin's corridors were still as stone. Guards shifted uneasily at their posts, sensing that something unusual was happening. A secure chamber glowed faintly with lamplight, where Russia's leader sat alone, the receiver pressed to his ear. Across the wire, thousands of kilometers away in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré spoke. His tone was measured, but his words cut with the precision of a blade. "History is not asleep," he began, his voice deep, steady. It has been watching. Watching while Africa has been drained, while her children have starved, while her gold and her sweat built palaces far from her soil. But the silence is ending, and whether Moscow wishes it or not, Africa will rise. The words carried through the static like thunder. The Russian leader did not interrupt. He had faced presidents and generals, men who wielded nuclear arsenals and entire economies. But this was different. This was not a plea. It was not diplomacy. It was a declaration. Traoré pressed on. Burkina Faso has seen the contracts written in secret. We have intercepted the plans. The same powers that once wore crowns now wear suits. They divide Africa with pens, with loans, with hunger. They think we are still chained. But we are not. A pause. Deliberate. Heavy. Then he continued, "And you, Russia, think you are different. You think you come as a friend. But do not believe Africa cannot see through the shadows. We know the double games. We know the deals made in darkness. And I tell you this, Africa will not trade one master for another." The Kremlin chamber froze. Advisors in adjoining rooms leaned closer to surveillance feeds, their pens forgotten. A single soldier, a young African captain in a red beret, was daring to confront the machinery of empire itself. "Do not mistake me," Traoré said, his voice tightening. "I do not call to beg. I do not call to negotiate. I call because the world must know Africa is not for sale. Our gold, our land, our blood, it will not be bartered in Moscow, in Paris, in Washington, or anywhere else. If Russia stands with us, it must be without chains. If you cannot accept that, then you are no different than the colonizers we buried." The Russian leader's fingers clenched on the receiver, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth, then stopped. What could he say? Every word had been calculated, carved like stone. Outside the chamber, aides whispered frantically. Some urged him to end the call, to dismiss Traoré as reckless. Others hissed that the young captain was dangerous, that ignoring him would only ignite his influence further. Back on the line, Traoré's voice dropped lower, steadier, like a drumbeat. "We do not seek war. We do not seek chaos. But if Africa must burn to be free, then we will light the fire ourselves. And if the Kremlin cannot understand this, if you cannot see that the old games are finished, then you, too, will be left in silence." The final word hung in the air. Silence. For a long moment, the chamber was frozen. The Russian leader stared at the wall, his reflection caught faintly in the polished table. The young captain had not shouted, had not threatened armies, had not spoken of weapons. Yet somehow his words carried the weight of revolutions. It was a silence unlike any the Kremlin had known. A silence that was not weakness but power. The silence of an empire realizing that a continent long dismissed as broken was speaking back with unshakable resolve, and in that silence the world shifted. Dawn broke over Moscow, a gray light spilling across the frozen city. Yet inside the Kremlin the atmosphere remained heavy, as though the call had left cracks in its very walls. The conversation was over, but its echo lingered. For the first time in decades, the fortress of Russian power had been shaken not by missiles or markets, but by a single African voice. The Russian leader sat long after the line went dead, his advisors circling cautiously, waiting for orders that never came. Reports were written, analyses drafted, but none could capture the weight of what had happened. Some called Traoré reckless, others whispered he was prophetic, but none could deny the truth. The Kremlin had been forced into silence. Meanwhile, across Africa, the midnight call spread like wildfire. No cameras had recorded it, no reporters had transcribed it, but somehow the story found its way into the streets. In Ouagadougou, people whispered of a leader who spoke without fear to the great powers. In Lagos, in Dakar, in Kinshasa, the tale reached markets and cafes, where voices rose with renewed defiance. Africa will not be sold. In Paris, there was unease. In Washington, suspicion. In Brussels, nervous meetings stretched long into the night. They had expected a young soldier to falter, to be swallowed by the weight of his enemies. Instead, he had stood like stone, and his words had become fire. But it was not just governments that trembled. Ordinary people, long silenced by poverty, oppression, and despair, began to feel something stir. They saw in Traoré not just a man, but a mirror of what they could become. Mothers whispered his name as they tucked their children to sleep. Soldiers carried it on their lips as they patrolled forgotten borders. Students scribbled it on notebooks, daring to imagine futures free of chains. And for Traoré himself, there was no celebration. No triumph, only a deeper understanding of the battle he had chosen. He walked the quiet corridors of his compound, the weight of his people pressing down on his shoulders, his red beret casting a shadow that stretched longer with every step. He knew the enemies would not stop. He knew the hunger, the sabotage, the betrayals would continue. But he also knew this. The silence he had left in the Kremlin was not emptiness. It was the sound of a crumbling order, the collapse of a world that believed Africa would forever kneel. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in shades of fire, he stood before his people once more. His voice carried across the crowd, not with arrogance, but with conviction. The world thinks Africa must remain silent. But last night they heard us, and they will hear us again, until the chains are broken, until the hunger is ended, until freedom is more than a word. The crowd erupted, not with chants of vengeance, but with the sound of a continent finding its breath again. And so, the story of that midnight call passed into legend. A call that no recordings preserved, no transcripts proved, and yet everyone remembered. A call that left the Kremlin in silence and Africa standing taller. And as history turned its pages, one question lingered like a shadow across the earth. Was this the night Africa began to break its chains?